What would you do if your dream retirement turned into a battle for survival? Imagine buying the land you've always dreamed of, only to find that the very people around you, the ones you thought were your neighbors, are determined to take it all away. For Thomas Miller, a retired teacher, that's exactly what happened. What started as a peaceful life on 5 acres of farmland quickly spiraled into a nightmare when the powerful Maple Creek Homeowners Association decided they didn't like what he was doing with his land. They told him his crops were an eyesore, and that was just the beginning. They threatened him, sabotaged his crops, and tried to destroy everything he'd worked for. But Thomas wasn't about to give up. He was about to fight back in a way they never saw coming. And he wasn't just fighting for his farm. He was fighting for justice. Stay tuned to find out how one man stood up against the system that tried to crush him, and how he turned the tables on the HOA in a way no one expected. Imagine, after years of hard work and sacrifice, you finally get to a point in life where you can slow down. You've spent decades shaping the future of young minds. Now it's time for your own peace and quiet. This was the dream for Thomas Miller, a 62-year-old retired teacher from a bustling city in the USA. After 30 years of molding students' futures, he bought a beautiful piece of farmland, hoping to cultivate something more than just crops. His dream was to live simply, grow organic vegetables, and enjoy the quiet rhythm of farm life. The land, 5 acres of rich soil on the outskirts of suburban development, seemed like the perfect spot. It was peaceful. It was untouched. It was everything he had worked for, and at long last, it was his. But what he didn't expect was a storm brewing just over the horizon. The first few weeks were magical. He planted tomatoes, cucumbers, squash, and peppers, selling some of his harvest at the local farmer's market. He felt a sense of accomplishment and freedom he hadn't known in years. However, as the rows of vibrant crops grew, so did the eyes that watched him. Neighbors, some curious, some critical, began to whisper about his rural ways. The smiles he received at the market quickly turned into questioning stares from the community. At first, it didn't bother him. After all, this was his farm, his dream, his choice. But little did he know that peaceful retirement was about to be shattered by a force he never saw coming. The Maple Creek Homeowners Association, HOA. It started as a casual visit. One morning, as Thomas was tending to his crops, a sleek black car pulled up near his property. Out stepped Eleanor Whitfield, the president of the Maple Creek HOA, wearing a pair of designer sunglasses, her posture straight and judgmental. She crossed the boundary of his farm with the air of someone who believed she had the authority to dictate how Thomas should live. With arms crossed and a stern expression, she didn't waste time. "You can't grow food here," she said dismissively, her voice dripping with disdain. "This isn't some country bumpkin neighborhood." Thomas paused, wiping the dirt from his hands, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Actually, I can. This land has been a farm for over 50 years, he explained calmly, hoping to put an end to the conversation. "I bought this land 6 months ago, after saving every penny I could from my teaching career. It's zoned for agricultural use." But Eleanor wasn't listening. She tilted her head and, in the most condescending way, declared, "I'm the president of the Maple Creek HOA, and your farm violates at least 6 community guidelines." She spat the word farm like it was something dirty, something beneath her. The very idea of organic vegetables growing so close to her well-manicured lawns was an insult. As she snapped pictures of his garden beds with her phone, she continued to criticize his crops, claiming the weeds were an eyesore and that the neighbors were complaining about the bugs and smells. But there were no bad smells, no pests that couldn't be dealt with naturally. Still, Eleanor had already decided that Thomas didn't belong. In the face of this confrontation, Thomas stood firm. "This property isn't part of your HOA. Check your maps," he said, showing her his deed. But Eleanor wasn't listening. "We'll see about that," she muttered, walking away with a final, cutting remark. "Expect official notice soon." And with that, she was gone. But the seed had been planted. A sense of unease settled in Thomas's chest. He wasn't sure what the HOA could do, but he had heard the horror stories about HOA overreach. He had a creeping feeling that his peaceful retirement was about to become a battlefield. Just days after Eleanor's visit, the official notice arrived. It was taped to his door. A thick envelope, official-looking and full of bold letters demanding immediate action. The letter stated that Thomas had 14 days to remove all agricultural activities or face fines of $100 per day. The reasons? Violation of community standards. It cited the aesthetic issues his farm was causing, even though he had done nothing wrong. It was clear this wasn't about the crops. It was about power. They were trying to bully him into submission, trying to destroy his dream before it even had a chance to bloom. Thomas could hardly believe his eyes as he read the letter. His mind raced, but he quickly calmed himself. He knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to let his dream, his hard work, and his livelihood be stolen by a group of people who thought they could control him. But even as he stood tall, the weight of the situation began to sink in. This was bigger than just a few crops. The HOA had sent a message loud and clear. Conform or be punished. The pressure started to mount. His neighbors, once friendly, were now whispering behind closed doors. Some even stopped to warn him that the HOA would stop at nothing. His farm, once the pride of his retirement, was now being seen as a threat to the community's value. Thomas felt a knot form in his stomach. He had worked so hard to make this dream come true, but now it seemed like his dream was slipping through his fingers. What was his next move? The stress of the situation weighed heavily on Thomas. The HOA's presence was felt more than ever. They started showing up regularly, driving by his farm in their expensive cars, taking pictures and making notes. He felt like a prisoner in his own home. He had already sent them a polite but firm response with his zoning documentation, proving his farm was outside their jurisdiction, but Eleanor and her committee had ignored it entirely. It seemed like they were determined to find a way to force him out, no matter the cost. And then it happened again. One afternoon, Thomas returned home from the farmer's market to find 3 HOA members, dressed in polo shirts with the HOA logo, walking around his property, taking photos of his crops. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. They were brazen, pulling up the tops of his carrot plants to inspect them, leaving exposed vegetables to bake under the scorching sun. The sight made Thomas's blood boil. He had worked tirelessly to grow those vegetables, to provide for his community, and now they were being treated like garbage. He installed security cameras, not only to protect his property, but to have the proof he needed. He had to stand his ground. But little did he know, the HOA wasn't done yet. They were escalating their campaign against him, and things were about to get even uglier. As the days wore on, Thomas found himself questioning everything. His retirement, his dream, his health. All were being dragged into a battle that felt bigger than he ever imagined. His health, once strong, began to deteriorate under the constant pressure. Sleepless nights and constant anxiety were taking their toll on him. Every morning, he woke up hoping the nightmare would be over, only to find new notices on his door and more threats from the HOA. Despite everything, Thomas refused to back down. His farm was more than just a piece of land to him. It was a symbol of freedom, independence, and a life lived with purpose. He wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. But even as he stood tall, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the fight. Every new notice, every new threat was like a punch to the gut. The farmer's market, once a place of pride, had become a reminder of what he was about to lose. His mind raced, running through every possible solution. Could he sell? Could he give up? The thought of leaving felt like defeat. No, he couldn't. He wouldn't give up. He had worked too hard for this moment. And if the HOA thought they could bully him out of his dreams, they had another thing coming. He wasn't just fighting for his farm. He was fighting for something bigger. For the right to live his life the way he chose, for the right to be left alone, to grow what he wanted, and to be a part of a community that didn't try to dictate his every move. But the emotional toll was becoming unbearable. Would he be able to weather the storm, or would the pressure finally break him, just when Thomas thought things couldn't get worse? The HOA struck again. This time, their actions were not just threats on paper. They were physical, destructive. He had spent days carefully nurturing his crops, watching them grow from seeds into flourishing vegetables. He was proud of every plant, every vine, knowing that his labor was providing healthy, organic food to the community. But one morning, as he walked down to check on his tomatoes and cucumbers, something was off. The air felt different. It wasn't the crisp, clean morning breeze he was used to. It was a heavy silence of destruction. As he reached the edge of his property, his heart sank. There, sprawled across the field, were deep tire marks, unmistakably made by a heavy vehicle. Someone had driven over his crops, flattening rows of fresh vegetables. His prized heirloom tomatoes, the ones he had cultivated for months, were crushed under the weight of the tires. It was as if a storm had come through and left nothing but devastation in its wake. His mind raced. How could this happen? Was it an accident? But deep down, he knew it wasn't. It was deliberate. The HOA had made their move, and it was more than just a nuisance now. It was sabotage. He immediately checked the security footage, hoping to find answers, and there it was, clear as day. 3 HOA members, dressed in their matching polo shirts, had driven onto his land in the middle of the night. They had deliberately run over his crops, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. He had been prepared for legal battles, for meetings, for paperwork. But this was personal. They weren't just trying to force him out of his land. They were trying to break him, to rob him of everything he had worked for. He stood there, shaking with anger, but he knew this wouldn't be the end. They had just made a grave mistake. It was time to fight back, not just for his crops, but for his dignity. The damage caused by the HOA sabotage left Thomas with a deep sense of loss. His tomatoes, his livelihood, had been crushed. But he wasn't going to let this stand. He took to repairing the damage as best he could. But the stress was beginning to get to him. He couldn't sleep, couldn't focus. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the ruined crops and the faces of the HOA members who had done it. But little did he know, that night, as he tried to get some rest, the HOA was preparing for their next move. It was around 2 a.m. when he was woken by the sound of movement outside. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but the noises grew louder. He threw on his clothes, grabbed his flashlight, and rushed outside. There, under the moonlight, he saw them. 3 figures moving silently around his property. One of them was carrying wire cutters. The unmistakable clink of metal on metal filled the air as the intruders made their way to the irrigation system. Thomas's heart dropped. They were cutting his water lines, his only means of keeping his crops alive in the heat of summer. Panic surged through him. Without water, his crops would wilt and die within hours. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming, but he quickly grabbed his phone and started recording. He captured the entire scene, their faces, their actions, the destruction they were causing. He wasn't sure what to do. Should he confront them? Should he call the police? But before he could make a decision, the figures disappeared into the night, leaving behind nothing but broken pipes and the cold realization that they had crossed a line. The next morning, Thomas found his crops drooping, lifeless, the irrigation system ruined. He knew it was no longer just about property lines or legal disputes. It was about protecting what was his, no matter the cost. With his crops destroyed, his water line sabotaged, and his trust in the HOA shattered, Thomas knew he had to take action. He couldn't let them get away with it, not after everything he had worked for, not after everything they had taken. But he wasn't sure where to start. This was no longer a simple misunderstanding. It was a full-on assault on his livelihood. That's when he called Sarah Johnson, an attorney who had helped his neighbor with some legal matters years ago. Sarah listened to his story carefully, her voice filled with empathy, but there was a clear sense of determination in her tone. Thomas, you're not alone in this. You've got a case, and I'll help you fight it. The HOA has no right to destroy your property or sabotage your crops. Let's take this to court. For the first time in days, Thomas felt a glimmer of hope. Sarah's words were a lifeline. She advised him to gather every piece of evidence he could, photos, video footage, documents, everything that could prove the HOA's actions. With Sarah's guidance, he began to build a case. They wrote formal letters, sent notices, and started the legal paperwork. It wasn't going to be easy. The HOA had deep pockets, and they would stop at nothing to get their way. But Thomas was no longer afraid. He had something they didn't, truth, and the courage to stand up for it as the legal battle began. The HOA didn't back down. In fact, they doubled down. The notices became more frequent, the threats more severe. Every time Thomas thought he could breathe, another letter would arrive, demanding that he cease his agricultural activities or face even higher fines. The fines escalated from $100 per day to $500 per day, then to $1,000 per day, all because of the HOA's fabricated complaints about his farm. The emotional toll was immense. The constant harassment began to affect every aspect of his life. He was physically drained, mentally exhausted, and emotionally defeated. He was being attacked on all sides, not just by the HOA, but by the very community he had once hoped to be a part of. Neighbors who once waved at him now turned their heads when he passed. It felt like everyone was against him. But despite it all, he knew one thing. He couldn't give up. He couldn't let the HOA's bullying tactics destroy everything he had worked for. He wasn't just fighting for his farm anymore. He was fighting for his dignity, for the right to live his life the way he saw fit. He couldn't let these people dictate his future. And so, the battle raged on, with each new notice only fueling his resolve. He had made up his mind. This was a fight he was going to win, no matter the cost as the legal threats mounted. Thomas realized he couldn't fight this battle alone. He needed help. He needed the truth to come out. He reached out to local journalists, sharing his story with the media. At first, he wasn't sure what kind of response he would get. Would people care about his struggle? Would they even believe him? But to his surprise, the story quickly gained traction. Local newspapers and TV stations picked up on the story of the farmer fighting back against the powerful HOA, and the public response was overwhelming. People started reaching out to Thomas, offering their support. He received letters, phone calls, and even visits from people who had heard about his fight. Many of them shared their own stories of HOA overreach, of neighbors being forced out of their homes, of personal dreams being crushed under the weight of bureaucracy. It became clear that this wasn't just Thomas's fight. It was a fight of anyone who had ever been pushed around by a powerful organization. The more people heard about his story, the more they rallied behind him. He wasn't alone anymore. The public outcry against the HOA reached a fever pitch. Local news stations aired segments about the case, with interviews from neighbors, legal experts, and even some former HOA members who had quit in protest of the organization's tactics. It was no longer just a local issue. It was a movement, and Thomas had become its face. The support from the community gave him new strength. He wasn't just fighting for his farm anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced or overlooked. As the legal and emotional battles deepened, Thomas felt like he was in over his head. Each day brought new threats, new fines, and more sabotage from the HOA. He had given everything to protect his farm, but there was a growing realization that this wasn't just a small neighborhood issue. The more Thomas dug into the HOA's actions, the more he discovered. It was as if a web of corruption had been woven right under his nose. Through an old friend who worked in local government, Thomas learned that the HOA members weren't just enforcing rules. They were involved in something much bigger. His research uncovered that the HOA president, Eleanor Whitfield, and her cronies had been pushing for the development of luxury condos right where his farm stood. The project had been rejected due to zoning laws, but Eleanor had promised her allies on the board big bonuses if they could convince farmers like Thomas to sell their land. That's when it hit him. His farm wasn't just an eyesore to the HOA. It was a roadblock to their financial gain. The more Thomas learned, the angrier he became. He wasn't just fighting for his farm anymore. He was fighting against an entire system built on greed and manipulation. The HOA wasn't simply trying to control the appearance of the neighborhood. They were using their power to push through their own agenda. This wasn't just a fight for land. It was a fight for fairness, for justice, and for the truth to come out. Thomas felt his resolve harden. It was time to turn the tables on Eleanor and her corrupt board. The more Thomas uncovered about the HOA's actions, the more he realized he wasn't alone in this battle. Slowly, neighbors who had been silent, some out of fear, others simply unaware of the HOA's true motives, began to step forward. Each person had a story to tell about the abuse of power they had witnessed or experienced firsthand. And with each new testimony, Thomas's fight gained more momentum. One by one, neighbors who had suffered under Eleanor's reign spoke up. Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who lived down the road, tearfully explained how the HOA had forced her to remove a beautiful flower garden that had been passed down through generations. It wasn't about the flowers, she said. It was about control. They wanted to make me feel small, to make me feel like I didn't belong. Then there was Mr. Rodriguez, a retired firefighter, who shared how the HOA had threatened to sue him for having a small vegetable garden in his backyard. I just wanted to grow tomatoes for my family, he said, his voice shaky but firm. But they told me I was ruining the neighborhood's aesthetic value. As more testimonies came in, it became clear that the HOA's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of overreach, manipulation, and coercion. These weren't just the actions of a few misguided individuals. They were a symptom of a larger problem. Thomas wasn't just fighting for his farm anymore. He was fighting for his neighbors, for his community, and for everyone who had ever been silenced by powerful institutions. The stakes were rising higher by the day. The HOA had escalated their threats, sending Thomas a letter that felt more like a desperate ultimatum than a mere demand. The letter, full of legal jargon and aggressive language, declared that if Thomas didn't comply with their wishes, they would place a lien on his property. The fines had reached an astronomical amount, and the HOA made it clear that they were willing to do whatever it took to force him out. It wasn't just the fines that shook Thomas. It was a realization that the HOA was actively trying to ruin him. They weren't just targeting his crops or his farm. They were targeting his entire future, everything he had worked for in retirement. This wasn't just a legal fight anymore. It was a personal attack. They wanted him to lose, to break under the pressure, to give up everything he had worked for. But Thomas wasn't ready to give up. Not now. Not when he was so close. He knew that the moment he paid those fines or gave in to their threats, they would win. He would be forced off his land, and his dream of farming would be lost forever. It was time to take the gloves off. With Sarah by his side, he began to prepare for the fight of his life. They were going to take the HOA to court, and they were going to win. This wasn't just about money. It was about standing up to bullies who thought they could take whatever they wanted. As the tension between Thomas and the HOA reached its peak, he realized that he couldn't win this battle alone. He needed the truth to be heard. He needed the public to see what was really going on. So he took a risk. He went to the media, reaching out to local news outlets, sharing his story with the world. He knew it was a gamble, but he had nothing left to lose. The response was overwhelming. Local reporters came to his farm, eager to cover the story of the little guy standing up to the powerful HOA. The story of his fight against corruption and harassment spread quickly, and soon his battle became a symbol of resistance for people all over the country. The public outcry was swift and passionate. Social media exploded with support for Thomas, with hashtags like #StandWithThomas trending across multiple platforms. People from all walks of life reached out to him, offering support, sharing their own stories of HOA overreach, and expressing their admiration for his determination. It wasn't just the local community that rallied behind him. It was the entire country. The more the media uncovered about the HOA's shady dealings, the more the public grew outraged. The HOA had underestimated the power of the people, and now the tide was turning. The support of the community gave Thomas new strength. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was a fight of every person who had ever been pushed around by a powerful institution. As the media continued to cover his story, the cracks in the HOA's carefully constructed facade began to show. Thomas's lawyer, Sarah, had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, gathering evidence and preparing for the courtroom battle. It became clear that the HOA's claims were based on lies, fabrications, and false pretenses. Sarah uncovered a crucial piece of evidence: a series of emails exchanged between Eleanor and other HOA board members, detailing their plans to force Thomas off his land. The emails included explicit instructions on how to manipulate the zoning laws to their advantage, all while pretending to be concerned about the neighborhood aesthetic. It was clear now. The HOA's so-called concerns about the farm were just a smokescreen for their true intentions, forcing Thomas to sell so they could make room for luxury condos. Armed with this evidence, Sarah filed a motion in court, presenting the damning emails that exposed the HOA's lies. The public was stunned. How could the HOA, an organization entrusted with maintaining neighborhood standards, have been so dishonest and corrupt? As the emails were read aloud in court, The faces of the HOA board members grew pale. Eleanor tried to keep her composure, but it was clear that the walls were closing in on her. The truth was out, and there was no turning back now. As the media continued to cover his story, the cracks in the HOA's carefully constructed facade began to show. Thomas's lawyer, Sarah, had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, gathering evidence and preparing for the courtroom battle. It became clear that the HOA's claims were based on lies, fabrications, and false pretenses. Sarah uncovered a crucial piece of evidence: a series of emails exchanged between Eleanor and other HOA board members, detailing their plans to force Thomas off his land. The emails included explicit instructions on how to manipulate the zoning laws to their advantage, all while pretending to be concerned about the neighborhood aesthetic. It was clear now. The HOA's so-called concerns about the farm were just a smokescreen for their true intentions, forcing Thomas to sell so they could make room for luxury condos. Armed with this evidence, Sarah filed a motion in court, presenting the damning emails that exposed the HOA's lies. The public was stunned. How could the HOA, an organization entrusted with maintaining neighborhood standards, have been so dishonest and corrupt? As the emails were read aloud in court, the faces of the HOA board members grew pale. Eleanor tried to keep her composure, but it was clear that the walls were closing in on her. The truth was out, and there was no turning back now. Just when Thomas thought he had caught a break, the HOA escalated their tactics to a level he never anticipated. After media coverage, the truth about their lies and underhanded tactics was out in the open, but Eleanor and the HOA weren't backing down. Instead, they decided to fight dirty. Late one evening, Thomas received a certified letter. This time, the ultimatum wasn't just a threat. It was a final demand. The HOA, in a last-ditch effort to force him out, had upped the stakes. They informed him that if he didn't comply within 24 hours, they would initiate a full-scale legal action, threatening to put a lien on his property, which would effectively destroy any chance he had of maintaining his farm. The weight of the letter felt heavier than anything else he had received from the HOA. This was a battle for more than just land. It was a battle for his future, his dignity, and the legacy he had worked so hard to build. The reality of the situation hit him hard. If the HOA succeeded, he would lose everything. His savings, his home, his dream of growing organic produce. Everything would be gone in an instant. But Thomas wasn't one to back down. He couldn't. Not after everything he had been through. Not after the sabotage, the threats, the lies. The thought of giving in to these bullies made him sick. He had worked too long and too hard to see his life torn apart by people who had no respect for the land or the people who worked it. This fight wasn't just about survival. It was about standing up for what was right. With a deep breath, Thomas sat down and called Sarah, his lawyer. "We're going to fight this. We can't let them win. It's time to make them pay for what they've done." As the legal proceedings continued, Thomas was determined to do everything he could to ensure that his story and the truth behind the HOA's corruption was heard. He knew that the court needed more than just evidence. It needed witnesses. He needed the voices of his neighbors, the people who had seen firsthand the damage the HOA had caused not just to him, but to the entire community. So he started to reach out to those who had suffered in silence, asking them to come forward and share their stories. The response was overwhelming. Slowly but surely, neighbors began to step forward. One by one, they came to court to testify about the harassment they had endured from the HOA. Mrs. Foster, a retired schoolteacher, spoke about how the HOA had tried to force her to remove a tree in her yard that had been planted by her late husband. "It wasn't about the tree," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It was about control. They wanted to dictate every part of my life, every part of my home. It was as if they didn't care about what mattered to us, only what they could get away with." Then there was Mr. Anderson, a mechanic, who shared how the HOA had harassed him over the size of his garage. "I didn't even know there was a rule about it," he said. "But they showed up, told me I had to tear it down or face a fine. I felt like they were just looking for an excuse to punish people." As these heartfelt testimonies were heard, the truth became undeniable. The HOA wasn't just a group of concerned neighbors. They were bullies, using their power to intimidate and control people for their own benefit. The more neighbors spoke out, the stronger Thomas's case became. The realization hit him hard. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was a fight of everyone who had been silenced by the HOA, the fight of every person who had been bullied by those who thought they were above the law. Just when things seemed darkest, a glimmer of hope appeared. Thomas had been relentlessly gathering evidence, digging through records and documenting everything he could about the HOA's actions. It was exhausting work, but he knew it was the only way forward. He had to expose the HOA for what they were, liars and criminals. And then one afternoon, after hours of poring over documents, Thomas found something that made his heart race. Hidden deep in the county zoning records, he uncovered a crucial detail, something that could change everything. The property his farm sat on was not just agriculturally zoned. It was grandfathered in as exempt from any new zoning changes. This meant the HOA had no legal authority over his land whatsoever. All of their claims, all of their threats, were built on a foundation of lies. With shaking hands, Thomas called Sarah. "I've got it," he said, his voice filled with relief and triumph. "This is it. They've been lying to us the whole time." Sarah's voice cracked with excitement as she replied, "This is huge, Thomas. We've got them now. We can end this once and for all." For the first time in weeks, Thomas allowed himself to feel a sense of hope. He wasn't going to lose his farm. He wasn't going to let them take away everything he had fought for. Armed with this new evidence, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about winning in court. It was about holding the HOA accountable for their actions and making sure they never got away with it again. The courtroom was packed as Thomas, Sarah, and their legal team prepared to face the HOA in what would become a defining moment in this battle. The stakes were higher than ever. If they lost, Thomas's farm would be gone. If they won, the HOA would be forced to pay for the damage they had caused, and they would never be able to harass him again. The tension in the air was palpable, and as the judge entered the room, everyone fell silent. The HOA's lawyer, a slick and well-dressed man, stood confidently and began to argue their case. He tried to paint Thomas as a nuisance, as someone who was disrupting the peaceful neighborhood. But Thomas wasn't intimidated. He knew the truth was on his side. He had the evidence. He had the support, and he had the heart to see this through to the end. When it was their turn, Sarah presented their case methodically. She introduced the evidence of the HOA's lies, their illegal actions, and the blatant disregard they had shown for the law. As she spoke, the room fell silent. The evidence was undeniable. The security footage showing the HOA's members trespassing, stealing his crops, and vandalizing his property was shown on the big screen, and the faces of the HOA board members, Eleanor, Thomas, and others, were frozen in shock and guilt. The judge's eyes narrowed as she watched the footage. "This is disturbing," she muttered. "How can a group entrusted with community standards behave this way?" Her words struck like a hammer. The entire courtroom was beginning to realize just how deep the HOA's corruption ran. As the days dragged on in the courtroom, the weight of the HOA's lies became more apparent. Every new piece of evidence that Sarah presented chipped away at their defense. Eleanor and her board members, once confident and smug, were visibly rattled. Their lawyer stammered and fumbled through his arguments, trying to save face, but it was clear their case was crumbling. The turning point came when Sarah introduced the emails between Eleanor and the HOA board, detailing their plans to push Thomas out and profit from the sale of his land. The emails revealed the true motive behind their actions: greed. It wasn't about community standards or property values. It was about making money by getting rid of anyone who stood in their way. When the judge saw the emails, she couldn't hide her disgust. "This is fraud. This is conspiracy," she said, her voice stern. "These actions are illegal, and they will not be tolerated in this court." The room fell silent as the full extent of the HOA's crimes was laid bare for everyone to see. Eleanor, once so poised, looked defeated. The walls were closing in on her, and there was no way out. With the truth exposed, Thomas knew that victory was within reach. It wasn't just a win in court. It was the beginning of something bigger. The fight had become a symbol of standing up against corruption, against those who thought they were untouchable. And for Thomas, it was the moment he knew he had finally taken back control of his life. As the courtroom drama reached its climax, the tension in the air could be felt by everyone present. The HOA's lawyer, One so confident now looked rattled, his arguments falling apart as Sarah delivered her final points with precision. The evidence was overwhelming. The HOA's lies, their illegal actions, and their blatant disregard for the law were now undeniable. The judge, who had remained calm and composed throughout the proceedings, now looked at Eleanor and her board members with a look of disdain. Sarah, knowing the stakes couldn't be higher, delivered the final blow. Your Honor, these individuals didn't just violate zoning laws. They violated the trust of an entire community. They harassed a peaceful citizen, destroyed his property, and attempted to run him off his own land for personal profit. This isn't about community standards. This is about greed, and they need to be held accountable. As Sarah spoke, the entire room fell silent. Eleanor, sitting at the defense table, couldn't even look up. She knew the game was over. The judge, with a grave expression, turned her gaze to the HOA's lawyer. You're asking the court to uphold a system built on lies and deceit. How do you justify that? The lawyer stumbled, unable to answer. It was clear that their case had fallen apart. Thomas could feel the weight of his determination paying off. He had fought, not just for himself, but for the truth, for his dignity, and for every person who had ever been wronged by this HOA. He held his breath, waiting for the judge's decision. The judge took her time, weighing all the evidence, all the testimonies, and the full scale of the HOA's misconduct. The courtroom held its collective breath as she leaned forward, her voice steady but firm. I have seen enough. This court finds overwhelmingly in favor of the plaintiff. The Maple Creek HOA has no legal authority over this agriculturally zoned property. Further, the actions taken by the HOA members constitute harassment, trespassing, vandalism, and theft. A wave of relief washed over Thomas, but the judge wasn't finished. I am awarding the plaintiff, Thomas Miller, for $150,000 in damages for destroyed crops, irrigation systems, emotional distress, and legal fees. Additionally, I am issuing a permanent injunction prohibiting any HOA member from entering Mr. Miller's property without written permission. Thomas couldn't believe what he was hearing. The way of the last few months, the stress, the fear, the constant battle, finally seemed to lift from his shoulders. His dream of protecting his farm, of standing up against the bullying tactics of the HOA, had not only survived but triumphed. The truth had won, but the judge wasn't done. Furthermore, she continued, this case is being referred to the district attorney for potential criminal charges, including theft, conspiracy, and criminal mischief. With the judge's ruling, Thomas felt a weight lifted off his chest, but his journey wasn't over. The road ahead would be full of challenges, but for the first time in a long while, Thomas had hope. The community that had once turned its back on him was beginning to change. Neighbors who had avoided him, who had been too afraid to speak out, were now stepping forward with apologies and support. It was as if a new chapter in his life was beginning, one where he could finally live in peace, surrounded by people who valued him, not as an outsider, but as a fellow member of the community. The news of the court ruling spread like wildfire through the town. People who had once sided with the HOA out of fear or ignorance now saw the truth for what it was. They had been manipulated, just like Thomas had, and now they were ready to help him rebuild, to restore what had been lost. Even some of the HOA members, who had once been a part of corruption, now found themselves turning against Eleanor and the others. With the support of his community, Thomas began to rebuild his farm, piece by piece. It wasn't just about the crops. It was about rebuilding his trust in the people around him. It was about creating a farm that could thrive once more, not just for himself, but for everyone who had supported him through the darkest days. One of the most surprising moments came when the interim HOA president, Mr. Ramirez, reached out to Thomas with an unusual proposal. He wanted to make amends, to rebuild a community that had been torn apart by Eleanor's greed and power. Mr. Ramirez suggested a partnership between Thomas's farm and the Maple Creek residents, offering to help fund a community garden on his land. In exchange, the residents would volunteer their time to help cultivate the farm, learning about sustainable farming in the process. At first, Thomas was hesitant. After all the hurt, the lies, the harassment, could he really trust him again? But as he thought about it, he realized that this would be a new beginning. It wasn't just about forgiveness. It was about growth. It was about using the lessons learned from this painful experience to create something better for everyone. And so Thomas agreed. In the weeks that followed, neighbors showed up to help rebuild his farm. They worked together, side by side, as a community, harvesting crops and planting new ones. It wasn't just about the vegetables. It was about the relationships they were building, the sense of shared purpose, the feeling that together they could create something beautiful from the ashes of the past. By the time the community garden project was fully underway, the transformation of Thomas's farm was nothing short of remarkable. What had once been a symbol of struggle, of conflict, was now a thriving center for learning, growth, and cooperation. The farm had become the heart of the Maple Creek community. It was a place where people gathered, where families came together to work the land, share stories, and learn about the joys and challenges of farming. The community garden wasn't just about growing food. It was about growing relationships, about building a stronger, more united neighborhood. Thomas had become not just a farmer, but a leader. He had shown the people around him that standing up for what's right, no matter how difficult, could change the world. And as he walked through his fields, now full of vibrant vegetables, he couldn't help but smile. This wasn't just a victory for him. It was a victory for the entire community. His farm, once called an eyesore, was now the most cherished part of Maple Creek. And as Thomas looked out over the fields, watching neighbors and children work together in the soil, he realized that sometimes the hardest battles lead to the most unexpected victories. He had fought for his farm, for his dream, and in the end, he had gained more than he ever imagined. He had gained a community that respected him, valued him, and stood by him through it all. And that, Thomas thought, was a harvest worth fighting for.